Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the information session for the FY2024 Adaptation Science Competition. We're just going to give everybody another 30 seconds to a minute for everybody to join, and then we'll get started. Thank you. All right, let's get started. Again, welcome to the Adaptation Sciences FY2024 competition information session. If that is the session that you signed up for, you're in the right place, or else, well, join us still. It's going to be fun. My name is Bhaskar. I am a program manager in the Adaptation Sciences program. I wanted to actually draw your attention to the email address at the bottom of this slide. Please use this to communicate with the team at any point in time after today. Next slide, please. All right, let's start with some webinar logistics. If you can hear me, well, you don't have to do anything else. You're pretty good. If you hear feedback or have connected via a phone, please hang up and ensure that your computer's audio is turned on. If you have a question, well, please write it in the question section. We will have a Q&A at the end of this presentation. A recording and slides of the information sessions will be provided on the website within a couple of days, and we'll make sure that we update the FAQs as appropriate. Next slide, please. Today's agenda, we're going to start off with an introduction of the Adaptation Sciences team members, followed by an overview of the NOAA Adaptation Sciences program itself. After that, there will be the general and competition-specific feedback from the LOI review process, and then followed by an FY2024 funding competition overview. And I will definitely draw you to the fact that the slide is going to have some information on full proposal submission process and some timeline, followed by question and answer. Before I turn it over to Lisa, let me introduce myself. As I mentioned, my name is Bhaskar. I'm a program manager with a focus on coastal resilience. I'm going to pass it on to Anne.
Thank you, Bhaskar. Hi, everyone. My name is Anne, and I'm a grants management specialist with CPO. Later today, I'll just be going over the steps needed in order to apply for a grant, as well as the how to register for the grant system that we use. Thanks.
Andrea?
Hi, everyone. My name is Andrea Morales-Barboza. I'm an AdSci program specialist, and now I'll pass it to our competition manager, Lisa.
All right, thanks everybody. So my name is Lisa Vaughn, and I'm a program manager for Adaptation Sciences, and I also direct our Climate and Societal Interactions international programs. So I'm glad you all could join us today. We very much appreciate your time and your interest in the funding competition. So let's go ahead, Andre, if you would, and get us started on the next slide. I am going to turn off my camera actually because I'm having a hard time seeing the slides from the small screen I'm looking at. So let me turn it off and I can make it bigger. All right, so I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with NOAA. We are the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Here is our mission here, science, service, and stewardship related to climate, weather, oceans, and coasts, and this is where we emphasize a lot of our work, getting actionable environmental information into the hands of decision makers. So if we go to the next slide, you can get an overview of the different components of NOAA. These are on the far left, those are what we call the line offices in NOAA. Just for context, you all are applying to a program within NOAA's Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research, and sometimes we just go by NOAA Research. We all sit in the Climate Program Office, where the program office really runs external grants and engagement and partnership activities, focusing on the physical, natural, and social sciences. Our part of the program, the Climate and Societal Interactions Division, really gets down into research focused on societal needs, engagements, vulnerabilities, impacts, and adaptation. Next slide, if you would. Thank you. So within the Climate and Societal Interactions Division, we have two primary components. We have two, we call them sister programs, but there's a lot of interaction among the two programs, particularly in terms of the people we fund and the types of research that we do. So the first is the Climate Adaptation Partnerships, formerly known as RISA program, and this is largely focused in the United States, and they are taking a regional cut at some of the issues we're all working on together. And I believe that we had several people register for the call from RISA programs, so welcome, and we really appreciate the cross-fertilization of our programs. The second program is the one that is hosting this particular funding competition in FY24, that is the Adaptation Sciences program. And you can see from this graphic here that we tend to take more of a sectoral or thematic focus in our work, but increasingly we are looking across systems, across sectors, across scales to really look at more complex dynamics, both in terms of impacts, risk, and adaptation to that risk. So we have several components: the water, the coast, the fisheries, and the international investments, but we do work very much across those lines. This competition, for example, would support projects that are really looking at adaptation across all of those sectors. And importantly, we hope that they will be looking at communities and scales where the intersection of risk and vulnerability and adaptation actually happens across these. So that's what we're looking for. I will note that in this competition, we expect that most of the work would be conducted within the United States, but we have identified in the NOFO some areas that we're kind of loosely calling transboundary. Might be a little stretch from a geographer's perspective, but we have identified some regions where we will consider proposals. We wish that we could have made this a global scale competition and cover all parts of the world, ideally, but we just didn't have the resources to do that this time around. So next slide, if you would. Okay, so in terms of our objectives of the program, our goal is really to advance the knowledge, methods, and frameworks needed to move society beyond incremental adaptation toward more widespread, connected, and transformative adaptive pathways and resilient strategies. And we're looking to better understand and help support clear economic, social, cultural, and environmental co-benefits. Nature-based solutions, for example, are a really good example of the type of adaptation that we're interested in, given the benefits for ecosystem services, like fisheries, tourism, carbon emission reduction, for example, carbon sequestration and storage. So that's kind of a good example of the type of way that we'd like to see some of these adaptations and evaluation work framed. So we have two key objectives. One is to develop an understanding of key drivers and conditions that shape and enable adaptation across multiple temporal and spatial scales. And the second is to identify key aspects of and promoting opportunities for the use of climate information to best support preparedness and planned adaptation that is, once again, of high value to social and economic goals. I would say this competition addresses more that first bullet than the second in a way, but I just want to share with you kind of the general framing of the program, and ways that we can connect those two objectives are always great. Next slide, if you would, Andrea. So I won't read this slide because I think if you're tuning into this call, you're already very much aware of why this research is needed. But in general, we're seeing adaptation actions occurring in many parts of the world, and this is a really good thing. But there's a sense in the community and in the funding organizations that work on adaptation that we really need to have a better understanding of the impacts of these actions. What are some of the enabling factors that make them success? What are the risks of maladaptation and how can we avoid those? And what is the impact of the aggregation of multiple adaptation actions in one place or within one sector, for example. So we've decided after consulting with partners to focus this investment, this competition, on trying to address that need for the evaluation of adaptation. And by need, I mean broadly, what is the evidence base out there? What are some of the frameworks through which we can support adaptation, but then also what are some of the best frameworks for evaluating adaptation? This is, I know, a small investment in a much, much bigger need, but we are hoping that this would be kind of a start for us in this area. So the info sheet has additional information on kind of the background and the context. So I invite you to go take a look at that if you would like further detail. But I don't want to preach to the choir here. I think everyone on this call probably has a good understanding of what this gap is and why it's needed. All right, next slide, if you would. So we have 2 competitions this year. Last year we only did 1, but this year we decided that we wanted to add a second one on that would kind of help really develop the longer term research in this space. So the first one is evidence building, evaluation, and learning approaches to support adaptation to a changing climate. And the second one is support for developing a social science research agenda in support of adaptation and resilience. All right, next slide. And I don't mean to rush through these, but I want to make sure we have time for dive into the meat of the competition a little bit more, because you can read all of this in the NOFO and the information sheet. So here's a little bit more detail about competition 1. As I mentioned, we want to expand the evidence base for evaluating adaptation actions and investments. We'd like to see proposals that will help develop, identify metrics and frameworks with an emphasis on those that measure social and economic outcomes of adaptation. And as the US government is putting a big focus on equity, we would like to also support that by kind of pulling that out here and asking that applicants consider how the adaptation that they are evaluating or the mechanisms or indicators that they are focusing on really address equity. And then the second point in this competition is to develop the frameworks, partnerships, approaches, and methods needed to evaluate adaptation. So as I mentioned here, we think a lot of the work will probably focus on the United States, but we have identified other regions, including the Caribbean, the Pacific Islands, Mexico and Central America, and the Arctic. And we do welcome regional or comparative studies that focus on multiple areas from this list. Unfortunately, we can't fund proposals that say included a case study in Africa and then one in the Caribbean, just because it technically isn't consistent with the NOFO. These proposals should be for projects up to 2 years of duration. It could be 1, with a budget of up to $150,000 per year. So I know this gets a little complicated, but the total proposal can be $300,000, but you can't exceed more than 150 years of funding for one of those years. I'm sorry, 150 years of funding, $150,000. So for example, if you're going to ask for $150,000 for 1 year, that's great, but you couldn't ask for $175,000 or $300,000 for a 1-year project. So based on the availability of funds, we're thinking really, it says 5 to 7 in the NOFO, but it's possible that we may fund maybe up to 10 or 11 this year. All right, next slide. So I'm not going to read these to you, but I suggest that everyone who submitted an LOI, and I know there's some folks on here who haven't, but we are looking for proposals that hit one or more of these topics. And so you don't have to address all of them, in your proposal, but we should be able to let the panel know that this was what we were asking for, and that they can then look at the proposals and say, yep, this proposal would contribute new and applicable insights on characteristics, co-effects, and enabling conditions, et cetera, or one of the other ones. So be super clear. My recommendation to you is to be super clear about which of these topics you would be addressing. All right, next slide. So in competition 2, recognizing that there really is a growing need for social science research investments in adaptation and resilience, we are going to hopefully support the development of social science research, a social science research agenda that would support adaptation and resilience. I want to point out that, you know, one of the important elements of this is an engagement process that brings in different perspectives, both those of the scientific community, and by that, I know that's a really large spectrum of disciplines and scales, right? But then also people who are actually implementing adaptation or stakeholders for adaptation actions. So we anticipate that there will be a combination of, you know, an assessment of scientific literature, actual plans and actions where that's possible, but then also engagement processes for developing the agenda itself. In other words, it should be grounded in some reality, so to speak. So in terms of scale, you know, we're not looking for one overarching, necessarily like NOAA specific social science agenda, but just trying to build and add to the knowledge about what are the research gaps and how should we as a very broad community be addressing them. Those proposals should also be 2 years or up to 2 years in duration, with the total budget in the range of $150,000 to $300,000. For this particular project, because of the possibility for doing potentially like an assessment part, you know, more of a desk study first and then bringing people together, we are allowing for the years to have different funding levels that exceed 150,000, if that makes sense. And if this doesn't make sense to you, you can clarify with us. But the language is very specific in the NOFO too, if you want to take a look at that. So depending on the availability of funds, we're thinking that 1 to 2 of these will be supported. The reason this amount is smaller is because we're kind of just putting our toe into this type of competition where we fund the development of a research agenda. So we want to make some progress, but then also evaluate whether or not a grant is a good mechanism to do that. So just so everyone is aware of that. All right, next. Oh, I do want to point one more thing. For proposals in competition 2, and I don't want to get in the weeds too much, but if we were to be developing a science agenda, a research agenda for NOAA, or say for EPA, or a very specific government entity, we would have to do that through a contract and not through a grant. So services to NOAA cannot be supported through a grant. So just make sure when you're developing your proposal that it has broader implications beyond NOAA. It could certainly focus on issues that are close to our hearts in NOAA, you know, coastal regions, for example, some of the stewardship issues that we work on, but there's no geographic limitation to this. NOAA does a lot of work in the interior of the country as well. So, but I just wanted to point that out just so everyone is clear on that. All right, next slide. So this slide and these bullets are actually a little bit different than those in competition 1, in the sense that we are hoping that proposals will be able to incorporate all of these bullets. I know that's a heavy lift and a lot to ask, but that would be the ideal. The last bullet on the international perspective, I would say you don't necessarily have to include an international perspective, but if there is a rationale for doing so, I think that's great. And I think we will probably wind up supporting, depending on the availability of funds, really maybe 3, for example, maybe a little bit more than 2, depending on how the budget shapes up. So I would suggest that you know, you try to make sure that your proposal is addressing all of those bullets, with the exception of the last one on international, although it would be great because it would really kind of help us with some of the international work, of course, that we do in partnerships with AID and Department of State to have that international perspective. And just as the need is great in the United States for this type of research agenda and the evaluation activities, it is also great in the international community, as many of you know. So next, please. Okay, so I won't read through this. These are in the information sheet, but just pointing out for some of you who might be new to our program, and to CSI in general, these are some of the approaches that we generally use. We really try to leverage and connect to the research, priority setting, and engagement capacity of key partners. Those could be regional, international, federal, state, other federal agencies for sure, NGO, private sector, and other community-based organizations. So that's a strong point in a lot of our projects, and I encourage you to think about that. We do have an interest in engaging with organizations, including the private sector, working in economic and community development. If there are links to be made with finance, I think that's something that our research programs could really help connect communities and other groups too. So that's something that we're trying to emphasize a little bit more, the climate finance and the connection to the research and capacity building. And then for this call in particular, we really are looking for research and evaluation activities as opposed to discrete adaptation project implementation within a learning framework. So for example, this is a research program, and so we can't fund the development of an adaptation project. But if you're partnering with an adaptation project to learn from them as they go, and there is, a small amount of support needed to, say, convene a workshop as part of that project, that could be something that you could propose. And then across the board, all of our projects should incorporate the principles of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. We do have a required statement related to this in the NOFO. I really encourage you, having managed several review panels over the last few years since we started including this, I really encourage you to reflect this in your methodology. So a statement at the end of the proposal is great, but I think over the time that we've been doing this, we've seen real maturity and richness coming out of those statements. And then the proposals that review well incorporate this into their methodology and flag it as such. So I would definitely consider doing that. Next slide. All right, so when we review these LOIs, we take a look at the body of the LOIs, and we provide specific feedback in many cases for your LOI and your specific proposal, proposed activity. But then we also kind of look across for common themes and develop recommendations that are useful for everyone. I would like to note that I'm just going to highlight a few here, but there is a longer, maybe 2-page list and maybe a little bit more developed list for those that didn't submit LOIs that we provided to everyone who did. So along with this recording, we will find a way to post that feedback into the FAQ section of our website. So I recommend everyone check back within a week or so. If you submitted an LOI, you have this in the email response from our team, so you should be able to read through it. So just a couple of notes here. We find that it's really helpful in the review process if the PIs or the applicants articulate their work in one sentence and consider putting that one sentence summary in the abstract. We find it's helpful for the review, but it's also helpful, we think, in kind of focusing the development of the proposal and making sure that everything you write and you develop as part of the project feeds back into that sentence. I would also note that we hope that you will make sure that the objectives in the proposed work are actually doable within the 24 months or 12 months, if that's what you propose, and clearly and very specifically outline the methodology that you will use to accomplish those goals. Proposals that seem overly ambitious and not appropriately resourced are often questioned by the review panel. So if you are leveraging previous investments or ongoing activities, definitely identify those relationships in the proposal and what their contributions are. Because if not, it might look to the panel like you've bit off more than you can chew and you don't have the resources. But if you're bringing resources from other places, that's great. And that can help kind of like mitigate any concern about that. Having said that, it's also important in these cases to distinguish what support is being sought from NOAA and just ensure that that work is not duplicative. And that in part is why everyone has to list the current and pending support, but sometimes projects have different names in the work that's actually, evolved over a year or two. So just make sure that you're clear about that in the proposal. So the next point, we really encourage applicants to be very clear about the long-term implications of their work, including the transferability of the project's outcomes and outputs. So as I said earlier, it's a relatively small investment for a really big challenge. And so panels like to see things that, make an impact in the place where they're occurring, the sector, the region, whatever it is. But then they also like for the work to contribute to the greater body of work and understanding and knowledge. So making those connections and then reflecting that in your methodology is a strong point in a proposal. I would say another element that I think increasingly we're asking PIs to do is, if your proposal is addressing specific knowledge and information gaps that were identified in the National Climate Assessment process, we just wrapped up with the NCA 5, please note and reference this in your proposal. It helps us track how our research is contributing to these assessment processes and helping to close those knowledge gaps. The next issue I already talked about: carefully review and consider your statement of diversity and inclusion. And then engagement plans. So your work with stakeholders and other partners should be well articulated and the methodology laid out in the proposal. Let's see. All right, next slide. Okay. All right. So just a couple of things, and I do want to introduce to people who may not be aware of this yet, but NOAA has switched grants systems. We used to use grants.gov and Grants Online, and now if any of you are current PIs, you know that we're transitioning to this new ERA GEMS. I think it's ERA Commons GEMS, and Anne will talk about that in a few minutes. But we've had some, kind of bumps in the road in terms of getting this system up and running. So I'm going to point out some things here that sometimes slow down the proposal process so that we have as much time as possible to, have a smoother ride with processing these. So if these things are not done, if your proposal is recommended for funding, we're going to have to kick it back and ask you and your sponsored program office to revise paperwork. And that's extra work on your end, and it slows down the process on our end. So trying to avoid that and head it off. So all budget numbers in your proposal should be rounded to the nearest dollar. Don't use cents. Everything should have a 0.00 at the end of the number. Second, the period of performance should be September 1st, 2024 to August 31st, 2026, or August 31st, 2025 if it's a one-year proposal. Any start dates that deviate from this will have to be revised should your proposal be selected for funding. We will not come back to you before the review process to ask that, because if a proposal is not funded, we don't want a university or an NGO or community to have to revise that work. So just a heads up though. And then applications with subawards should include an SF424A. It's a form, it's all over the NOFO, and a budget narrative / justification with the table included for each sub-recipient. All right, next slide if you would. So just a few words on partnerships and collaboration. We request that all of the PIs, lead and co-PIs, unfunded partners, participants, etc., be listed and described in the project narrative. Please describe their roles and responsibility clearly. And we strongly encourage applicants to provide letters of support or commitment acknowledging the involvement or role of non-PI partners. And these kind of have two flavors. One is if you have an unfunded partner that is, has funding from another award and is going to work with you on this joint project. We want to make sure, or the panel wants to make sure, that that person's time and that institution support them spending their time working, in collaboration with you. So that's one type of letter of support. That's kind of more a letter of commitment. The letter of support is if you're working with a group of communities or institutions, whatever they may be, panels always appreciate the letters of support, and it kind of reinforces the potential success of the project in their minds. And this is just having sat through many review proposal panels and also been on review panels. It makes them feel like, yep, they have the pieces in place to do a good job with this project. I will note this is especially important if you're working outside of a place that you reside in, right? So if you live in and work in Florida and you want to do work in the Caribbean, in pick an island, but you want to do work in Jamaica, for example, you need to show the panel that you have the connections and the networks already in place to undertake the work, because these are short projects, right? So there's not a lot of time to kind of develop those networks. We'd like to see people hit the ground running by the time they get funded. Next, we hope that you will include all of the necessary disciplinary expertise within your group of PIs. And same thing with the above point. If you're enhancing your capabilities through unfunded partnerships, just make sure you include that individual or that institution's role and a letter of commitment. All right, next slide, if you would. So just a couple of points on specific to each of the competitions. Competition 1, and this is based on the LOIs we received. So while measuring and evaluating climate impacts, risks, and vulnerabilities is super important for advancing adaptation and resilience, our competition this year, because we have limited resources, really focuses on the evaluation and evaluation research related to adaptation and resilience, as opposed to the evaluation of climate impacts, risks, and vulnerabilities. There can be work done on that latter category, but it has to contribute to evaluation or evaluation research. And it needs to be very clear in the proposals. Second, and I think I talked about this, so I won't get back to it, but just related to, the inclusion of implementation or capacity building activities. Just make sure it's part of your framework and your methodology for addressing the core objectives of the competition. All right, competition 2, this is the development of the social science research agenda. Oh, sorry, thank you, Andrea. Just a couple notes. While we do expect projects to obviously draw from various sources, as I said earlier, strong proposals will really consider and engage local and similar forms of knowledge in addition to broader engagement processes to inform the needs. So in other words, we think that a proposal, given our program and the way we normally work, we think a proposal that is just an analysis of literature is probably not going to review as well as one that has that component, but then also develops through an engagement process more buy-in and more support and more, I don't want to say consensus, but more of a engagement process as opposed to just I don't want to say desk study, but of just a literature assessment. And then, should you choose to include an engagement process, let's just make sure that it is well designed and clearly articulated in the methodology section of the proposal. We find that people who apply to CSI programs often do this, so it's not that that's a problem, but we just want to remind folks, particularly those who might be new to this type of work. And then finally, the social science agenda should have broad relevance and be useful to the interdisciplinary scientific community and broader players in this landscape of adaptation. All right, next. All right, so just some brief competition information. I won't walk through this. A bunch of links, so if you're not sure where to go, you can take a look at these. We do have an applicant checklist on our webpage. That is new to our program this year. It's not something you submit. It's just really meant to make the process of tracking what you've done and the page limits a little bit easier for applicants. That's the last link here on that list. And then just for a couple notes for people who aren't familiar with our programs in CPO. So the NOFO is the document that contains the official guidelines and requirements. The information sheet is just a little bit of additional context and information about the program itself that we provide for applicants, just as additional kind of insight as to what we're looking for and what we fund. All right, next. So the overall process, the NOFO, the official guidelines, were published in November. letters of intent were due at the end of December, and I do apologize for the timing because I know a lot of people are out late December through early January, but it was the only way we could get this SNOFO done in time for funding for this fiscal year. That process has passed. I want to remind people that while we really encourage LOIs, they aren't required, and you can still submit a full proposal. So feel free to do so, but I would just suggest reading carefully through the LOI feedback that we'll post online. Proposals are due March 20th, 11:59 Eastern Time. They must be submitted through grants.gov. Actually, I won't get into that because I think Anne's going to. And then we'll conduct a review process utilizing review panels during the March, April, May kind of time frame. You could probably expect to hear whether or not your proposal was recommended for funding sometime in late May, early June, I hope. And then there is work that is done on processing awards. The grants management division actually signs off on these awards. As program managers, we just recommend them for funding. And then the project start date, once again, please use September 1st, 2024 in your start date. And then I'm not going to walk through here this slide in the interest of time, but this just is kind of a summary of the page limits, but also it's in the NOFO itself, and that's the bottom line requirement, to be honest with you. That is the legal document. And then you can check in the checklist as well. All right, so I think I'm going to wrap up here and hand it over to Anne. You know, full proposals have to be submitted through grants.gov. If you don't have the internet, you cannot mail them to us. You have to snail mail them to us. And if you're going to do that, please let us know ahead of time. And we need to make sure everyone's registered and has their accounts and their ducks in a row on grants.gov and this new system, ERA. I will note that in the past, using Grants Online, we have had problems, or PIs have encountered problems. I'm thinking that it might be even more difficult for us this year because you all are going to be getting used to a new system. We're getting used to a new system. So we really encourage you to not wait until the end of the deadline. I would really submit 2 to 3 weeks ahead of time, to be honest with you, if you can. I'm not saying you are required to. I'm just giving you advice. And then that's the deadline. And then, we did want to say, sorry, next slide, if you would Andrea. We did want to say just a little bit about the review process. This is in the NOFO itself. So there are essentially 2 elements that will be considered for each proposal. The first is the technical review, and that accounts for 75% of the total score. The attributes that are considered here are, okay, I think there's, okay, I'm just going to note these here, but scientific and technical merit, qualifications of the team, and the appropriateness of this budget, and that's that issue I referred to earlier, is the budget in good synchronization with the objectives and the methodology. And then outreach and education component, and then diversity and inclusion component. So that's important in the review process. In component 2, we are looking for relevance to the adaptation sciences program and to NOAA more broadly. I will note though, because this is important, is the scientific and technical merit and the appropriateness of the budget also involve a degree of relevance, really discussion, right? Because they're saying, can you meet the objectives of the competition through the methodologies that you have? So it does, whether or not you're hitting the targets of the competition isn't just 25% of the total score. It truly is like kind of a fundamental issue that is addressed really in reality by component 1 and component 2. Then those proposals are ranked by the panel, and we look at how much funding we have available when we get our final appropriation, because we all know we don't get those as early as we used to. Then we see what we can fund, and the determination is made by the ranking. As always, final decisions are conditional on funding availability. All right, next slide, just a quick mention. So within this program, we really like to continue to work and engage with our PIs that are funded and the broader community. So we ask that if you're going to submit a proposal, that you be willing to undertake an ongoing dialogue with the Climate Program Office, our specific program, and relevant partners. And I will flag for people who have NOAA funding, because of the new system, we now have to require twice a year reporting. So that is a different approach. So just make sure you're on board with that. And then respond to periodic data and information requests. And then we have traditionally had communities of practice that meet within AdSci. The last one actually got together a couple of years ago, so we are due for another one. But we think that's a great opportunity. And just for a note, for those of you who are involved in the FY2023 competition on island resilience and the CAFA climate adaptation for fisheries, we're trying to find ways to kind of bring those together so there's a broader base to learn from and engage with for you all. So I'm not going to read through this next slide because I'd really like to hear, I am going to make one point, sorry. And then I'll turn it over to you, Anne. Just a couple of notes. For-profit institutions are eligible to apply, but please note that the results of the work are public and cannot benefit one entity or be used for profit. And the second I'd like to just point out is that we can't support federal salaries through this process, and they're not able to submit through grants.gov. If you are with a federal agency and you'd like to apply, please reach out to me directly. I do want to flag that if we try to fund another agency, that requires the development of an interagency agreement between those two agencies, and that has to be reviewed and approved by the Office of General Counsel at NOAA and by the applying agency. So just to note that those funds probably wouldn't be available, just thinking about how long that process can take, until late 2024, early 2025, given that extra step. So just want to let you know. Okay, and I'm sorry for rambling. Anne, it's all you.
All right, thank you, Lisa. Hi, everyone. So I'll be giving a brief overview of the steps that need to be taken in order to apply for a NOAA grant. So this part of the presentation will mostly be relevant if you're a first-time applicant. If your institution has applied for federal grants in the past, you should have all the necessary IDs and registrations and accounts, but I would recommend checking to make sure everything is up to date and in working order. I gave a longer version of this talk at the LOI info session, so if you were there, please bear with me and hopefully you'll find this to be a useful refresher. And then after that, I'll be going over the steps to register for ERA, which is the new grant system that NOAA adopted, like Lisa mentioned. We were previously using Grants Online, but now all recipients of federal funding at NOAA will need an ERA account to accept their award as well as to manage their award. So just to clarify, you don't need an ERA account if you're just applying for a NOAA grant, but you will need one should you get selected for funding. All right, next slide. Okay, so the first step is to attain an EIN number, or an employer identification number. An employer identification number is a 9-digit number that's issued by the IRS. It's kind of like a social security number for institutions. And in order to apply for one, you can do so online, via fax or mail if you're based in the US or in the US territories. We would definitely recommend applying online. It's just the most quick and seamless way. If you're an international applicant, unfortunately, you don't have that option. You can apply over the phone. And if you think your institution has an EIN, but maybe you've misplaced that information, you can actually call a number. It's on the IRS website. You can call a number and they can help you find your EIN. And another reason to apply online is people who do will receive their EIN immediately upon completion, whereas if you apply via fax or mail, it'll take a lot longer. Next slide, please. Okay, so once you've attained your EIN, now it's time to register on SAM.gov and obtain a unique entity ID, or a UEI. So the UEI is a 12-character alphanumerical ID assigned to an entity. It used to be known as the DUNS number. In organizations, UEI will be used across federal systems. It's going to be used in grants.gov, it's going to be used in ERA, and if you're based in the US, you will be using ASAP, which is the system we use to draw down funds for your award, and your UEI will be necessary for that as well. Once your institution is assigned a UEI, it does not expire, but it can become inactive. So you have to renew it every year. So even if your organization has a UEI, just check to make sure it's active. If it's not, you'll have to renew it, or else you won't be able to receive funds without an active UEI. Next slide, please. Okay, so if you're applying as the prime awardee or the institution who will be receiving the funds directly, you will need a SAM.gov registration. If you're only applying as a sub-awardee, you don't need a SAM.gov registration, but you will need a UEI number. So the SAM.gov registration process can take up to 10 days, and you can register on, I think, yes, we provided a link at the bottom of the slide where you can go to apply or register for SAM.gov, as well as a link with helpful resources in case you get stuck. And like I mentioned before, all institutions, regardless if you're the prime awardee or sub-awardee, will require a UEI, but only the prime awardee requires a SAM.gov registration. Next slide, please. So once you have your UEI and SAM.gov registration, you can apply for grants.gov. So we have the link on the slide to register for grants.gov, and that link also includes a short video and that goes over the registration process. Once you've created an account, you'll have to create a profile for your organization and what's called a workspace. Instructions on how to create a profile, create a workspace can be found in the grants.gov user guide, which has information on how to perform a whole range of tasks in grants.gov. And should you get stuck, should you have more questions or face technical difficulties, you can go to the grants.gov support desk. They're actually available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, excluding federal holidays. So please feel free to open a ticket with them should you have any technical difficulties. Next slide, please. Okay, so should your proposal be selected for funding, you will have to register on ERA. So no, we recently transitioned back in October. ERA is an NIH system. So if your institution receives NIH grants, then you might already have an ERA account associated with your organization. But if not, the person known as the signing official, the SO, or the person who's authorized to sign off on the grant agreement should be the individual who creates the account. Once the signing official creates the account, then they'll be able to create other accounts for other users within the organization, including the PIs. So registering for ERA Commons can take up to 4 weeks to process. We definitely recommend that applicants register as soon as possible. I would recommend registering as soon as we inform you that your application has been recommended for funding. So it may take maybe about 8 weeks or so between the time that your application gets recommended for funding and the time that our grants division reviews and approves your application for funding. So in that time period, please go ahead and get started with the ERA registration process. Next slide, please. So here in the slide, we have a link to register, as well as instructions on how to register. So you can reference the second link on how to register, not only for registration, not only for the registration task, but also for post-award tasks like submitting a progress report, submitting a financial report, revision requests, if you ever want to shift funds around in your budget. So I would highly recommend you bookmarking this link. If your proposal gets selected for funding, you'll very likely be utilizing the guidance in this link. And that's all I have regarding the registration process and ERA. Just to reiterate and emphasize what Lisa said earlier, please start the registration process as soon as possible. You really don't want to miss a submission deadline because of a technical issue. Thanks.
Thanks, Anne. That's awesome. Really appreciate it. All right, so last slide. I'm not going to talk anymore. I promise we'll answer some quick questions. So just the last slide with some links. We will do our best to get through every question today, but just looking at time, we probably won't be able to, but we will answer them and put the answers on the FAQ. Give us maybe, you know, up until midweek to get it posted because we have to work with someone else to do that, and we'll answer them. But let's go ahead and jump into the questions if you guys want to. Bhaskar, are you starting to read them?
Yep, I'm here. Let me actually pull this up. All right, so Lisa, one of the first questions that we got was, can you define evaluation research?
I thought we were going to start with the first ones that were submitted ahead of time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we started there
Sure.
because people took the time to ask the question first. We should answer.
No, that makes total sense. So one of the first questions that we got when people registered was, we feel like we may be wasting our time on this proposal and would like to get a better feel for whether a small tribal entity such as this has a viable proposal. The tribe is unique because Conchiti Reservoir is located on tribal lands.
Okay, thanks, Bhaskar. Yeah, so I will say, you know, this type of community is definitely eligible and would be, I think, a good research site for this competition. I'm assuming it's a competition 1, but I'm not sure. So, you know, my answer may not be applicable if it's competition 2. But I will say, so really kind of, to me, this is asking a question about scale. We don't have a preference outlined in the NOFO or the information sheet for scale, and we have supported work at very, you know, different scales in the past. So this having been said, given that we are a federal agency with relatively small resources needed for this competition, we do encourage applicants to consider the broader implications of the work for similar communities, for example, and to reflect that in the methodology. I would make sure that the research conducted takes us beyond what could be perceived as kind of an internal program review. So, and I know that's kind of a thin line, right? Because if we're evaluating or conducting research on a particular adaptation plan or activity, there are programs, right? But we just want to make sure that it is larger than and has broader implications that are brought out in the project proposal for other communities and others who are interested in the same topic, might be the best way to put it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So the next question is a co-PI who is from an NGO outside my institution considered a sub-awardee if the project gets funded?
Yeah, so, and there, I think we had another question about this as well, but you can apply with multiple entities in 2 ways. You can apply with one proposal from one entity, one institution, and that could be the NGO, it could be a university, and then do a sub-award to the second. So that's one option, and there are instructions for how to do this in the NOFO on page 18. Thank you, Anne. Or they can submit a separate proposal. Everything should be similar. The title, the project narrative, it should be very obvious when it hits Grants Online that we have 2 proposals with the same titles. Put it that way. That's how we identify them. There are some different requirements for the institutions though, and you'll need to look at page 18 to see. So you have 2 options: do a sub-award or multiple applications for one project. All right, go ahead.
Okay, so here are the next question. For projects involving multiple institutions, it seems that each institution must submit a separate proposal for the same project. Can you review the procedures for doing this, including elements needed for NOAA to link these separate proposals?
Oh, okay. I think I probably just went over that, but the answer is no, you do not have to submit separate proposals. You can submit one proposal from one lead PI and their institution, and then you can do sub-awards to other institutions. Just remember, for those sub-awards, you need the information that we talked about earlier on the slide. You know, you need budget forms, you need budget table, and you need budget narrative for the subaward.
So Lisa, there are a couple of questions about templates. Say for instance, here's a question about CVs. Do you have a template, that can be submitted, that that the team can actually share with the group?
Yeah.
There's also another question about, there's another question about that is also true for current and pending research. So do we have any templates?
No, we really don't have any templates. We have the checklist that you can use, but that's not even a template. I would just say if you have another template from another agency, like the Cyan CV BioSketch, you can use that template if it's uploadable. We don't have a system that you can upload it into. I would just say whatever you do, just make sure it is consistent with the page limit in the project narrative. And then just thinking about other areas. So current and pending research, we don't have a template for that section either, but I would suggest that you hit the highlights of that work that is most directly related to this competition. So if you did something, 10 years ago that was totally unrelated to this, you don't necessarily need to highlight that. What we're looking for is, does the team have the qualifications to do this work? And then also, to be honest with you, making sure that we're not duplicating efforts that are already funded by either other donors or other federal agencies, because that's a requirement within NOAA.
And there's another question about a template for a letter of support, and you've already answered that question. And the letter of support needs to be addressed to you as a competition manager, right?
Yeah, that's fine. Yep.
Awesome. Now, moving on to this.
One more thing, it can be to me as the competition manager, but we've also had them addressed to like the lead PI. There's no requirement for that. So, but in general, they're usually addressed to the competition manager.
That's good to know. Can you define what you meant by evaluation research?
Yeah, I mean, we're looking for research that advances our understanding of the impact of evaluation actions. So, broadly, that could be developing methodologies for evaluating adaptation. It could also be evaluating an actual, program kind of work where you're evaluating an actual adaptation, either policy or implementation. It can be looking at things as specific as metrics and indicators that we can use then in other places to evaluate adaptation. But that's how we're developing and kind of thinking about this competition. I'm sure there's a way more technical answer for that, but that's all I'll throw out for now.
Okay. What are some of the requirements for data sharing plan in terms of content?
Yeah, so if you look on page 29 to 30 of the NOFO, there's specific guidance, but a typical plan should include descriptions of the types of data and information that are expected to be created over the course of the project, the tentative date by which the data will be shared, standards to be used for data, metadata, format, and content, methods for providing data access, approximate total volume of data to be collected, and prior experience in making such data accessible. I will note that this is applies to all of CPO's programs, some of which are more relevant to certain types of data, right? But we like to see how you're managing the data and information coming out of this. I also think for our programs, it's good to include a few sentences on how you will share this information, with stakeholders and with a broader audience. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. But the technical requirements are on 29 and 30 of the NOFO.
Okay, so here's another question, Lisa. Do you have any advice for applicants in institutions, agencies, states that have limited or outlawed DEIJ work?
That's a really good question, to be honest with you, and we haven't been asked that before. And that's a really good question. I think that you could address it through the methodology in your proposal without using those words that are kind of flags for that type of work. So you could point out that you are providing childcare because you are inviting a group of people to come to a workshop or for some sort of feedback conversation. And that the panel will see is, okay, you're trying to be inclusive of those who don't have childcare, for example. So in the statement itself, I don't know what to tell you other than it is required as part of the NOFO. So I think you just have to come up with language that is acceptable within the context that you're working in. And I can try and look into that a little bit more. But I think my best answer for you is going to be do what you can. And you can show in your methodology that you are working to be more inclusive.
And would it be okay to actually say that if we have more information, that once we put this online, that answer will be available to the others to, for their, for them to read, right?
Yeah, I think we could do that. I think we could do that. I don't know that we'll be able to get a formal, I put it this way, I don't think we can say if you are in such a state, you don't have to include that statement. That's why I'm kind of hesitating a little bit about further guidance. But yeah, if we find out anything, we'll write this in. But my best advice to you would be incorporate the actions into your narrative and do the best you can in the statement section.
Do you think we have time for one more question, Lisa?
Yeah, and I mean, if folks want to hang on for a couple of minutes, I'm fine going for another like 5 minutes or so if people want to.
So I'm going to go a little out of order here. There's a question here. It's the question is participant support allowed? Are POs allowed for sending a small amount of money without setting up a sub-award?
Do you mean like for, well, I guess, yeah, you can do participant purchase orders. Yeah, you can do participant travel costs, right, Ann? I mean, participant expenses. There should be a list of what is allowable in the NOFO.
Yeah, I think that would fall under participant support expenses. I think that's what it's called.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, one more here. Can proposals include as a first task a planning period of 3 to 6 months to prepare for place-based collaboration with specific communities?
I mean, you can propose that for sure. I will say, thinking about how that might appear to a review panel, you just have to have made sure that it comes across that there's a reason that you are doing this and that you have a high success for achieving the goals of your project. So if you provide a rational and justifiable explanation, and this is a tricky thing because we do support out of this program the CAPRISA activity. Those are 5-year projects that occur in a particular place, and most of the PIs live in that region and so already have a lot of those connections in place. With our program, they're shorter grants, so there's not as much time to allow for that. But if you can make a case and you can demonstrate, maybe you demonstrate the methodology and you demonstrate that you've used it in the past and it's been successful, and you've outlined why you think this is needed and what your strategic objectives are and how you think this is critical, I think you could do that. I would just say write a really strong justification for it.
Okay, so I'm going to go for the last 2 questions. One of them is about page limits. The question is, do budget tables, narrative for each sub-awardee, letters of support, do they all come under the page limit that's actually mentioned?
So I guess the question would be if they count against the page limit in the project narrative. There is specific instructions, an instruction section, and I'm not remembering what page it's on, in the NOFO about how the page limit might differ for different types of proposals. So I just recommend that you go back and read.
On page 12.
Oh, thanks, Ann.
Yeah, it's where the page limit is. And I believe it was referenced in the question, but letters of support are not included in the page limit.
Yes, thank you for that reminder. Thanks.
If it's okay, let's go for the last question. The last question is, will we be notified when the FAQ is posted?
Sorry, I couldn't hear. Did you say will people be notified when the FAQ is posted?
That's right. I'm so sorry about my dog.
No, that's okay. That's the nice thing about Zoom calls is you get to know everybody's families. Okay, so I don't think we have, well, actually, let me ask a question. Andrea, do we have everybody who's on this call? Do we have their emails logged into the registration?
Yeah, we do.
Okay, we can try and send out an email and let you all know. Yeah.
All right, I think that's pretty much all of the questions that we have. Oh, Lisa, go ahead.
Next one question. So I see that somebody asked if the LOI guidance has gone out. It has. If you submitted through the Google form and you haven't heard back from us, just drop us an email to the Adaptation Science address or to mine, either way, and we'll double check. We used a Google form for the first time and it seems to have captured everybody who submitted, but on the off chance that something didn't work, just let us know. But yes, that has gone out. And once again, we will post the more detailed feedback for both competitions on our website when we post the FAQ, once we figure out how to do that. But I think we.
All right. Thank you so much, Lisa, for answering all the questions. And thank you to everybody for attending this information session. Good luck on your applications, and we hope to hear from you soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Take care.